Oh my gosh. You're really going to make me follow Naveen? Really? And the Oscar thing? That's cruel. Naveen, I'm sorry you had to slog through that entire biography, but that was very kind of you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is so lovely to see you all. How are you doing? Pretty good? Your brains are not full yet, I'm hoping. I know you've had a full day already. It is really a sincere pleasure for me to be with you today, and I so appreciate the invitation. You know, in preparing for today, though, and the video underscored this, many of the products that Vopak stores, well, I think they get underappreciated for the role that they play in people's lives. So I thought the video was nice, and it's a nice touch to have these products actually at your tables. But it's not the only thing that gets taken for granted. I would like to argue that energy is another thing that gets taken for granted, especially in the parts of the world that have ready access to it. In fact, I would challenge that it's hard to name a human activity that does not require energy. Really hard. It's obviously central to your business, but it's really central to all businesses, which is why I'm really pleased, tickled to be here to talk to you today about what the energy system might look like, not tomorrow, but 50 years from now, which might seem like an impossibly long way away, but energy systems and big infrastructure like that actually take very long time to transition. So looking out 50 years, actually I think is totally appropriate. Now, of course, if I knew the answer definitively for what the energy system would look like in 50 years, well, I would own Nordstrom's instead of just having Nordstrom as my last name. I would be a much wealthier man, and I would buy you all drinks after the meeting. So I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but what I have to offer today is grounded in real trends and examples that are visible today. And at the end, I would like to lay out, and I know this is a little presumptuous, but I want to lay out at least some of my thoughts, though I'm new to Vopak, of some of the vital products that I can imagine you storing in the future based on what I think that energy system is going to look like. And then I would really love to hear from you. I think we're going to have some time at the end for questions. I'd love to hear from you how you see the world unfolding and what questions this might leave you with. Before I leap into my remarks, though, I do actually want to just pause and, applaud you. I was blown away when I found out that Vopak is more than 400 years old. I don't think you last as any kind of institution, let alone a business, for more than 400 years without getting really good at anticipating where the world is going and what the market will need from you in that future. So coming from a country that is a little more than half as old as your company, and I'm talking here about the United States, in case you couldn't tell from the accent, we're just a young whippersnapper compared to Vopak. So I come to you with a certain amount of humility in my remarks. And I just want to congratulate Vopak. That's an extraordinary history and track record. And maybe it's because of this founder's mentality that I have read about, this idea that you don't limit yourselves to what you know today, nor by what you used to do in the past as necessarily guiding what happens in the future. In any case, whatever you attribute it to, I applaud it. That green button, Andre, I'm counting on it. There it is. I didn't actually doubt you. I knew that would work. So I would like to start by pointing out that whether this was intentional or accidental, actually the long arc, the history of and the evolution of human energy use is one of steadily decarbonizing our sources of energy, really from the moment we cut down the first tree. So wood was our first energy source, right? And then with the Industrial Revolution, we discovered hydrocarbons, right? And the reason we call them hydrocarbons, obviously, is because they have both hydrogen and carbon in them in different ratios. And it just so happens that the order in which we discovered them, coal, then oil, then natural gas, each of those sources of energy actually have progressively more hydrogen in them than carbon. So the next logical step on the train, if you were to follow this to its logical conclusion, is that we would just leave the carbon behind altogether and just use the hydrogen. And I know that Vopak is already exploring this possibility of the role of hydrogen in the energy system with your blue hydrogen to green hydrogen vision project in Rotterdam, which I also applaud. So you'll notice hydrogen will pop back up later. But for now, I just want to say that this steady decarbonization of the energy system is really the underlying theme of what I want to say to you today. I also want to say that I very much appreciate the company's commitment to sustainability, both as a business challenge, yes, but also as an opportunity. And I actually do really strongly believe that it's both. And in fact, as you can see from my brief outline here, I'd like to argue that a shift toward a more circular economy is really a prerequisite for the evolution of the energy system and sort of forms the backdrop for the evolution of the energy system. And I say that because the larger economic system that we end up having will heavily influence the kind of energy system we end up pursuing. Now, the rest of my remarks really focus on what the future looks like for each of these three major sectors of the energy system: electricity, transportation, and the thermal sector, so heating and cooling. So first things first, what do I mean by a circular economy? Okay, before I leap into that, I just need a swig of water. You can't talk about the circular economy with a dry mouth. It's well known. So this is going to oversimplify things a bit, but you can think of today's system of production and consumption globally as largely a straight line, right? We take things out of the ground, off the land, we produce things, and then we throw them away, for the most part. We have some recycling of some kinds of materials, but really, at least at a high level, macro level, the global economic system functions like a straight line. And you don't need to be a biologist to know that linear systems eventually exhaust themselves. Could take a long time, but they eventually exhaust themselves. And they put incredible pressure, and I think increasingly we're seeing unsustainable pressure on natural systems, both to provide us resources and absorb, maybe more importantly, absorb our wastes. And you can think about the largely fossil-based energy system that we currently have, so coal, oil, natural gas, really mirrors that same linear mental model, right? We dig up coal and oil and gas, we use it for productive uses, and then the waste product we're just now putting in the atmosphere, principally carbon dioxide. So to be sustainable from a resource standpoint, the world is going to need to shift from that linear model to a closed-loop model, to a circular economy in which we are moving resources, whether that's water or energy or materials, in the same kind of elegant closed-loop cycles that you find in natural systems. That's how natural systems function. Waste from one part of the system becomes food for another. This doesn't mean that there's going to be no mining. It doesn't mean that. But it does mean that we will shift toward increasingly using resources that are already in circulation and working harder to find ways to squeeze value out of every part of the value chain and from resources that we currently think of as wastes. Now, there are lots of examples of a circular economy around the world, but allow me to give you just a quick story from Brazil, and it's about the steel-making company ArcelorMittal. Now, steel is already, as a material, it's a very circular material in the sense that it's already the most recycled material in the world. More than aluminum, paper, glass, and plastic combined. So we're already doing a pretty good job with steel. But steel production still relies on finite resources, and it produces a lot of waste in the production. For every ton of steel produced, you get about 600 kilograms of other stuff, of waste, things that have been thought of as waste products. Carbon, slag, dust, sludge, heat, gases. So ArcelorMittal, through careful analysis and better material flows, together with identifying local industries that they could sell the remaining byproducts to, ArcelorMittal Brazil has now been able to sell and reuse internally roughly 90% of what was previously categorized as waste. In addition, as a replacement for coal in making steel, they actually raise eucalyptus forests on land that was previously degraded by cattle grazing. And those forests rebuild the soil, they improve water quality, they restore the health of the ecosystem. And those fast-growing trees, you can harvest them in 5 to 10 years. They then turn those into charcoal, and that charcoal replaces coal in carbon-neutral steel production. And it's carbon neutral because those trees take up CO2, more CO2 when they grow than is given off when you burn the charcoal to make the steel. Very elegant. So in the end, by harnessing those circular economy principles, ArcelorMittal has restored 135,000 acres of land and earned an extra $46 million in selling the byproducts. And now, Brazil, through ArcelorMittal's efforts, is the first and only country that I'm aware of in the world that's using renewable biomass to make carbon-neutral steel from sustainable certified forests. So, if a circular economy means closing resource loops and eliminating the whole concept of waste, as I said before, where waste from one part of the system becomes food, if you will, for another, then you can think of the climate problem really at its simplest as being a symptom of this same linear model, as I said before. So since the Industrial Revolution, we've unintentionally disrupted the Earth's carbon cycle. Right, the carbon cycle is complicated, but just to give you a glimpse of what I'm talking about, when we and other animals exhale, every time we breathe out, we're exhaling carbon dioxide, right? And plants take it up as they grow. It's actually a really elegant symbiotic relationship. So that's a part of that carbon cycle, and yet in the geologic blink of an eye, we have taken all of these carbon-rich resources that were nicely tucked underground, coal, oil, natural gas, and we have reintroduced in a very short period of time billions of tons of carbon that was nicely tucked underground for millennia. And I think you only need to believe in physics to see that reintroducing that much carbon is bound to change the carbon cycle. So in a way, solving the climate problem is essentially about restoring the natural carbon cycle as part of a larger shift toward a circular economy. In fact, I would argue that there will be growing social and market pressure for all products, including energy, to contribute to a more circular economy. And as just one last example, I would point to the fact that 187 nations just recently added plastics to the Basel Convention. That's a convention, international treaty that governs the movement of hazardous waste from one country to another. Why did they add plastics? Because there's great concern about global plastic pollution. And it's not to say that plastics are bad or plastics don't have great uses, but we now find them in every corner of the earth. So we could do better at closing that resource loop. So since Vopak is committed to contributing to a low-carbon energy system and energy future, and is already positioning itself really to develop the key infrastructure that will be necessary to serve those energy systems in the future, I'd like to turn now to the big trends that are shaping the energy sector. And first up is electricity. Now, I realize that electricity may in some ways seem like the least relevant to Vopak's core business. But I'd like to argue that to the extent electricity takes market share away from other energy carriers like oil and natural gas, it's actually highly relevant to Vopak's core business and might well be one of the main things that changes the kinds of things you end up storing 50 years from now. So, despite the fact that energy-related CO2 emissions have actually gone up in the last year, 1.7% globally, there's incredible momentum to decarbonize the energy system. And I think electricity is going to be first to decarbonize, really for three main reasons. And the first is consumers. Consumers are demanding it. And by consumers now, I mean both individuals and households, but also companies with sustainability goals, cities, and states. I want to start with individuals. In the United States, the millennial demographic, the millennial generation, which is people 18 to 34, is now the single largest demographic block in the US. More than us baby boomers, which I bring up the tail end of. According to Deloitte research, millennials are demanding clean electricity. A recent Edison Electric Institute survey of consumers, and Edison Electric Institute is the sort of the research arm for the electric utility industry, they found that a whopping 70% of consumers want 100% renewable electricity in the near future. That was the way the wording came out. And what's more striking still is that 51% said they would pay as much as 30% more in their bills to have 100% renewable electricity. I don't know if I'd pay 30% more, but that is extraordinary. So consumers love clean energy. And that's true for companies too. They're also consumers, and they are demanding more clean electricity, and they're turning to their utilities and saying, if you won't deliver it to us, we'll buy it ourselves. Just a couple of quick data points. In 2015, there was more wind power capacity purchased by companies than by electric utilities. I'm going to say that again. More wind was purchased by companies than by utilities. Nearly 2/3 of Fortune 100 and almost half of Fortune 500 companies have ambitious renewable energy targets. And finally, you may know of this group. There's a group called RE100, so for Renewable Energy 100, that's tracking more than 150 companies globally that have all made commitments to 100% renewable energy. And you'd recognize these companies: Google, IKEA, Apple, Facebook, Microsoft, Coca-Cola, Nike, General Motors, and of course, Lego. Now, the second big reason why the electric sector is going to decarbonize first is the rapidly declining costs for both wind power and solar. Again, these are US numbers, but they're relevant globally. Wind has hit an all-time low. There are now in the US new wind projects come in at a cost of 2 cents a kilowatt hour and sometimes less. Utility scale power purchase agreements are being signed for between 3 and 5 cents a kilowatt hour, and again, even lower in some parts of the world. And there's a recent research done by two different research institutes, one called Vibrant Clean Energy and the other Energy Innovation, that documented this is just months ago, that they did an analysis of coal plants in the United States and found that 74% of coal plants cost more to operate last year than if you just closed them down and built new wind and solar. And in fact, renewables are doing so well in the marketplace that they're actually threatening another low-carbon source of electricity, and that's nuclear power. Between cheap natural gas and increasingly cheap renewables, they're putting incredible market pressure on aging nuclear plants, so much so that the International Energy Agency just recently, like within the last few weeks, issued a report that warned that the share of nuclear power, especially in advanced economies, could fall by 2/3 by 2040. And without some sort of additional support for nuclear power, the transition to a low-carbon energy system will both be made more complicated and probably slower. Now, all of this together helps explain why large utilities everywhere are shifting away from coal. The war on coal, I hate to say it, Mr. President, is not being waged politically, but by the marketplace, by cheap gas and cheap renewables. And you see utilities following the market. They are shifting away from coal and toward energy efficiency, wind, solar, energy storage, and natural gas. So, the third and final reason that the electric sector is going to decarbonize first is public policy. And despite what you see at the federal level in the United States, which is no action on climate, there's actually an incredible amount of action at the state level. As this map suggests, There are a growing number of states that have announced their intention to go 100% renewable electricity, 100% renewable energy, or carbon-free, or clean. If we had time, we could unpack the differences in those terms. They actually do have some meaning, but for our purposes, the point is the same. More and more states saying, we're going that way, we're going west. We want more, we want 100% carbon-free energy or clean energy. You also see in the United States something called the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is a bipartisan group of 24 governors, 24 states, that have come together to say, we know that the federal government isn't on board with the Paris Climate Accord, but we are. And those states together represent 55 million people. And if they were an economy, their economy would represent about a $12 trillion economy. In fact, the only economies larger than those 24 states taken together would be the US and China. Globally, there's something called the Under 2 Coalition that involves 220 governments across 6 continents and 43 countries that's also committed to decarbonize. So I would urge people not to be misled by the fact that it looks like there's inaction at the federal level in the US, because the action is at the subnational level. And I want to not forget cities. So close to 70% of the world's population is projected to live in cities by 2050. And cities all over the world are also making ambitious clean energy and climate commitments, including 100 of the world's largest cities, and in the US, 500 cities and growing. And in fact, the London-based climate group recently did an analysis and found that those subnational actors, states and regions, are actually decarbonizing way faster than the G20 governments that they live within. 3.2% faster, to be precise, and they're just 0.2% away from the rate at which they would need to decarbonize to meet the Paris Agreement. So don't overlook those states and cities and companies. Now, I realize that the title of this slide sounds a little more like a light beer commercial than an energy trend, less carbon, more electricity. But I think it captures well what's already unfolding globally, which is precisely because electricity looks like it's decarbonizing first, there is great interest in then electrifying more parts of the economy, thinking that that's going to be the fastest way to decarbonize the energy system broadly. So perhaps it should not be a surprise that the International Energy Agency has just recently documented that electricity continues to assert itself as the fuel of the future. Global electricity demand grew 4% in 2018, and this growth in electricity demand pushes it toward a 20% share of total final consumption of energy. And of course, this is not rocket science. For electric utilities, the math is pretty simple. The idea of selling more electricity, electrifying more uses, that's very appealing. Analysis by the Brattle Group suggests that if we were to electrify transportation, space heating and cooling, and water heating, just those end uses, you could reduce greenhouse gases 70%, and electricity would increase its market share from today's 19% to 50%. Now, I don't know what the market capitalization is for the oil and gas industry, but I'm sure it's with a T, and utilities are, I'm sure, interested in that. Now, that alone, just that alone, electrifying those uses alone would certainly change the market for many of the products that Vopak currently stores. So here's the future of electricity that I see in 50 years. There's a lot more energy efficiency, probably twice as efficient as we are today, including the capture and recovery of waste heat in all kinds of applications, which we now just vent. More renewable energy, including hydropower. More transmission lines, which I know nobody wants to live next to, but more transmission lines that knit the electric grid together better, especially if you have a high renewable energy system, right? These variable resources, it's not always windy, it's not always sunny. You need to be able to move power kind of at will across an electric grid that's very well connected. There also will need to be more flexibility. I think there will be more flexibility on the demand side. We used to just build however many power plants we needed to provide the amount of power that people wanted. In the future, it'll be just as important to manage the amount and timing of demand as it will the supply. And yes, there's going to be natural gas. And then I have some question marks over those things in the middle box because I genuinely don't know. I think they're all going to have a role. We still don't have a good way to store electricity on a seasonal scale. And things like hydrogen and nuclear power and renewable natural gas, I'm confident they're going to play a role. I just don't know how big a role yet. And the reason I say some natural gas in this future is because I think there's going to be growing pressure to limit the amount of net new natural gas power plants unless they're paired with carbon capture, which is a subject I'll come back to later. So in the natural gas industry, we already see growing interest from the natural gas sector to explore how they can decarbonize themselves so that they stay competitive with electricity. They don't want to be electrified out of business. So, in fact, we're just about to start a project ourselves with the natural gas industry to go take a deep dive on just what the business model might look like in the future for them in a low-carbon world. What does a low-carbon world want from the natural gas industry? So in the end, the bottom line is that the decarbonization of electricity increasingly feels like a when, not an if. And it's just down to how fast and what the precise resource mix might look like. So now, let's turn to transportation. Transportation, I think, is going to be the very next sector to decarbonize. And it's in large part because of what I just got done saying. As we decarbonize the production of electricity, there is growing interest in electrifying transportation as the best way to decarbonize that transportation sector. But before I talk about the trends in transportation, I want to make 2 points about this graphic. The first is that we have been steadily electrifying the economy since about 1950. We've already been electrifying kind of on a pretty steady path, at least in the commercial and residential sectors. And the second point I want to make about this graph is that there's enormous headroom to electrify transportation. You can see by that very bottom line, hardly any. And while this data is focused on the United States, this actually holds true globally, both the steady electrification and the headroom. And while electrification of transportation is driven in part by climate concerns, it is, but electrification of transportation is actually not the only shift, the only big shift that's taking place in transportation. We actually see 4 big trends that are shaping that sector, and I want to touch on each of them just briefly. The first is that a growing number of countries have announced that they will ban internal combustion engine vehicles by some date certain. Now, the dates differ, but by my count, we're now up to 11 countries that have said, beyond a certain date, we're just not going to have internal combustion engine vehicles anymore. I don't, frankly, expect that to happen in the United States, but you could imagine that list of countries growing. And today, it includes Austria, Britain, China, France, Germany, India, Ireland, Israel, your home of the Netherlands, Scotland, and Taiwan. Now, even if it were just China and India on that list, these bans are going to dramatically, and already are, dramatically reshaping the entire global vehicle market, rippling through the entire thing. Almost all the automakers have announced that they're going either all electric or mostly electric. And I want to focus just on China for a minute because they are now the largest car market in the world. China has announced new quotas on the sale of electric vehicles, demanding that they be 10% of vehicle sales by 2021. That's 2 years from now. And it's not just passenger vehicles. China is deploying something like 9,500 electric buses every 5 weeks. That's the size of London's entire bus fleet. Every 5 weeks, all electric. It's hard for me to wrap my head around the scale of what's happening in China. And of course, they're not doing it just because of climate. They're doing it because they think these technologies are the ones that will rule in the future. Which takes me to the second big trend in transportation, which is driven in part by these bans on conventional vehicles, and that is the electrification of transportation, sort of the second big trend. So as battery costs have dropped something like 77%, maybe not surprisingly, you see EV sales rising 160%. I want to share just a couple of other data points. So global car makers have announced commitments to invest $90 billion in electric vehicles. So think Ford, Nissan, Daimler, VW, Audi, General Motors. Something like $19 billion of that in the United States, $21 billion in China, and $52 billion, a whopping $52 billion in Germany. That last one is so large because the largest single investment is coming from Volkswagen. They plan to spend $40 billion by 2030 to build electrified versions of their 300-some global models. And in the US, you've got General Motors, who's now outlining plans to introduce at least 20 new electric vehicle models, including fuel cell vehicle models, by 2023. Most of them on a new flexible platform that they plan to introduce in 2021. So even though electric vehicles represent less than 1% of vehicle sales globally, there are 90 million vehicles sold, EVs represent less than 1% of that. Tiny, tiny fraction. And yet, AutoNation, which follows this, expects that by 2030, EVs will make up 15 to 20% of new car sales just in the US. And according to Deloitte, last year, in 2018, global EV sales surpassed the 2 million unit mark. That's the first time that's ever happened, and double the amount that was sold in 2017. And you know, it's hard to name a successful technology that grew arithmetically. They almost always grow exponentially. JP Morgan estimates that by 2025, EVs and hybrid electric vehicles will account for an estimated 30% of global vehicle sales. And the ownership costs of battery electric vehicles is expected to be comparable to their petrol and diesel counterparts globally by 2022. And I haven't even talked yet about heavy-duty vehicles or transit buses. On the bus side, Bloomberg New Energy Finance estimated recently that 80% of all public buses will be electric by 2040. Much faster, actually, than passenger vehicles. I did mention China earlier. I just have to say the city of Shenzhen, China, is the first, to my knowledge, in the world that's converted their entire public bus fleet to electric buses. That's 16,359 buses for a city of 12 million people. And they did it, turns out that if you don't let people vote, you can make things move really quickly. I would just say in terms of Vopak's business, it is worth noting that, again, according to Bloomberg, for every 1,000 electric vehicle buses, so for every 1,000 EV buses that hit the road, there's a drop in demand for fuel of 500 barrels a day. So right now there's about 385,000 EV buses on the road and growing. And it looks like EV charging infrastructure is not far behind, right? It's also growing quickly. EV charging infrastructure is expected to have a compound average growth rate of more than 33% between now and 2023. That's according to a firm called Technavio that follows this. This is a real marker of how things are changing. Even Chevron is now offering electric car charging at some of its stations. So, I would put to you that vehicle electrification is coming, and probably faster than we imagine. So there are two trends. I need a swig of water. There are two trends that I haven't talked about yet in transportation. Connected autonomous vehicles and transportation as a service, both of which really deserve hour-long talks themselves. Don't panic, I wouldn't do that to you. Not 2 more hours coming at you. But I do think both of these things are going to happen, and they're going to happen because of a convergence of technologies. Maybe that's how innovations always happen. And that combination of technologies are increasingly cheap batteries. I showed you that slide of declining battery costs earlier. Solar PV, which is also declining in cost. Electric vehicles, which we just talked about, and really dramatic improvements in computing power, which is what makes autonomous vehicles even possible. Combine that with new business models, like ride-hailing, think Uber and Lyft, which basically took advantage of the insight that our cars are parked 96% of the time. Would you build a storage facility and use it 4% of the time? I don't think so. 4% asset utilization for cars. There's a futurist at Stanford, Tony Seba, who's argued that this convergence of technologies, along paired with these new business models, is going to disrupt both the energy sector and the transportation space permanently. And in fact, he goes on to argue that oil demand, as a result, is going to peak at 100 million barrels a day in 2020 and drop to 70 million barrels a day in 2030, and that the equilibrium price will be $25 a barrel, and it won't be able to compete with unconventional sources, and that'll be that. Now, I don't know if he's right or not, but he makes a very persuasive argument that that convergence of technologies represents not an energy transition, but a technology disruption. And in the case of electrification of transportation, that's not going to be enough to decarbonize the transportation system, not by itself. It might achieve maybe 80% decarbonization in some regions, but we're also going to need to shift to lower carbon, zero carbon, even carbon negative transportation fuels for some kinds of uses that don't lend themselves to electrification, like, for example, air travel. I don't think you're going to be getting on an all-electric plane anytime soon, although there might be a hydrogen plane in your future which could use electricity using a fuel cell. So air travel right now accounts for about 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions, which sounds small, but the International Civil Aviation Organization estimates that emissions from air travel globally are expected to go up more than 700% in the next several decades. So in any case, the future of transportation and some of the things you might store include things, some of which you're already storing. Biofuels, cellulosic ethanol, renewable natural gas made in any number of ways. You can either through gasification or anaerobic digestion or power to gas, which we'll talk about in a minute. Carbon negative fuels would be combining biomass and fossil fuels and then pairing that with carbon capture. You could actually have a carbon negative fuel. Hydrogen, synthetic fuels made from CO2, and low carbon oil, which again would mean pairing it with carbon capture. I also think that, and this you can see this already happening, I think there's going to be a renewed emphasis on designing cities to avoid the need for travel altogether. It's stuff we already do, walking, biking, and electrifying some of those, electric bikes and scooters all over the place already, transit, and then other kinds of shared mobility services that we've touched on. So the final part of the energy system that I want to briefly talk about is the thermal sector, which often gets overlooked in discussions about the energy transition. It's maybe, I don't know why, it's either not as sexy or it's just plain harder. So we're talking about heating and cooling, and we're talking about industrial uses of energy. The thermal sector, I think, is going to be the last and probably the hardest to decarbonize, in part because in industry, there is such a high need for high-temperature process heat in ways that make electrification probably not suitable for lots of those industrial uses. And here, again, I want to touch on just 4 trends briefly. The first is that electricity demand is already growing in buildings, and that's partly due just to growth in electricity demand broadly, but also because of increased electrification of heating. This is especially true in emerging economies. And while further electrification of buildings is probably a good thing from a carbon standpoint, it's likely to put great pressure on the natural gas industry. And in fact, the International Energy Agency, under their new policy scenario, they run these various scenarios, suggests that really ambitious energy efficiency measures combined with some electrification of heat demand could lead to as much as a 25% drop in the peak monthly demand for natural gas. And you add this to a gradual decline of natural gas in the industrial sector for some of the same reasons, and the net effect, they think, is that by 2040 you could see a reduction in peak natural gas use by almost a third. Now, in terms of replacing natural gas or complementing it, the two most promising alternatives to natural gas are biomethane and hydrogen, which interestingly, both of those can be blended with natural gas. Now, the biomethane, as I said earlier, you can make in any number of ways, either through anaerobic digestion or gasification. And hydrogen also can be made in a wide range of ways. The power-to-gas strategy that Germans and others are working on and more utilities are examining basically takes excess renewable electricity when that's available, splits hydrogen from water, the H out of the H2O. You can either inject that hydrogen directly into the natural gas system, up to 10%, in fact, probably at higher percentages if you had the right pipelines, the right sleeves. Otherwise, hydrogen can cause embrittlement of conventional pipes. And then if you have hydrogen left over, you can combine that with waste sources of CO2 to essentially make your own methane, right? That's CH4. It's the main constituent in natural gas. So you've now made, that's the power to gas part, you've now taken excess renewable power and made natural gas renewably, which you then can inject in the natural gas system. Returning briefly to the industrial sector, it's now the second largest emitter of energy-related carbon dioxide emissions, and it's responsible for about a third of global emissions. And just interestingly, there are three sectors in the industrial sector that make up the bulk of emissions, and that's steel, cement, and chemicals. And in that last category, since I know that's among the many things you store, just three chemicals represent about 70% of the total energy use in the chemical sector. And that's high-value chemicals, ammonia, and methanol. Now, I know Vopak doesn't make chemicals or any of the other things you store for that matter, but perhaps your chemical customers would appreciate your partnership in helping them figure out how to reduce their carbon intensity. Whoops. I went too far. No, I didn't. I didn't go far enough. That's where I want to be. So before I summarize the future of the thermal sector, I want to just pause and highlight carbon capture technology because I think it doesn't often get talked about, and because I think it's going to play just an absolutely essential role in all parts of the energy system, I want to take just a minute to talk about some developments in the United States recently that I think actually have global significance. So after 6 years of effort, something called the Carbon Capture Coalition, it's a very diverse coalition that I'm proud to say we put together. It's got more than 60 members. It's oil and gas, it's environmental groups, it's labor. Work together, this is actually very Netherlands-like, per the conversation we were having over lunch. This coalition got together and achieved a consensus and managed to get through Congress a reform to something called the 45Q tax credit, which is a tax credit for the capture and beneficial use of carbon dioxide. We don't need to go into the details, but it's worth pointing out that we had, in today's political environment, we had the most conservative and the most liberal members of Congress voting for this tax credit for carbon capture, even though we can't seem to agree on this country on the climate issue. Now, there is an entire new industry emerging that's so new it doesn't really even have a settled name yet around carbon. Some are calling it carbon tech, some call it carbon recycling. Whatever the name, a group called Carbon 180, used to be called the Center for Carbon Removal, has estimated that it's a $5 trillion plus global market in carbon, whether it's direct air capture or a raft of other technologies. These are all companies that capture, transport, perhaps store, and convert waste sources of carbon dioxide into a wide array of products and services, from concrete and fuels to materials to beverages and textiles. Now, in addition to the Carbon Capture Coalition, I'm proud to say that GPI also staffs a number of groups at the state level, including a 14-state carbon capture work group, a regional deployment initiative that's focused on getting the pipeline network built, a carbon capture leadership council of CEOs and others, and then a governor's partnership for carbon capture, all with an aim toward mainstreaming this set of technologies. The modeling involves, the work involves modeling and planning for actual deployment of carbon capture projects, and we're focused initially on ethanol and steel and cement. Now, the map I'm showing you offers an illustration of the potential for large-scale CO2 management from where CO2 is produced to where it might get beneficially stored or used in some other beneficial way. It's intentionally very high level because we didn't want people squabbling over how we're going to route pipelines. The main point I want to leave you with is that carbon capture is going to play an essential role in every one of those energy sectors that I've talked about, because it's going to be needed for a wide range of industrial processes and really for any future fossil fuel use. So in the commercial and industrial sectors, the future of thermal energy looks like super insulated buildings. Think passive house designs, the kind you see in Europe, advanced waste heat recovery, electrification using things like air source and ground source heat pumps, ice storage using cheap renewables overnight. As I've said, replacements or complements to conventional natural gas, including biomethane, renewable methane via power to gas and hydrogen, and geothermal, solar thermal, and district heating and cooling systems, which again, you see widely in places other than the US, just a few in the US. In the industrial sector, I want to just pause briefly on chemicals, because I know that's maybe most relevant to Vopak's business. So for example, both ammonia and methanol production turns out produce flue gases that are up to 85% carbon dioxide, even without additional processing. So pretty pure streams of CO2 that would lend themselves very well to being paired with carbon capture technology. Hydrogen, too, as I've said earlier, offers great promise, both as a chemical feedstock, a transportation fuel. Hydrogen can be a way to store electricity on a large scale, and hydrogen can also be a source of high-temperature heat for processing. Now, I also think it's possible that in the future, in that thermal space, that bio-based chemicals will begin to take market share away from petrochemical-based chemicals as those bio-based refineries strive to take market share. Because you can produce, we're just talking about using a different carbon stock, right? Instead of the carbon stock that's underground, we're talking about using the one that's above ground in biomass to make the same kinds of things, fuels, materials, chemicals. Now, I should hasten to add that bio-based alternatives today require about 3 to 5 times more energy per unit than their petrochemical cousins. So it may still require some additional innovation. In any case, it seems quite certain that the global energy transition that we expect over the next half century, a little less, is going to change the products of value that Vopak stores, although you'll still be doing it with great care, I have no doubt. In fact, as I read the materials preparing for this, since Vopak interprets that with great care part of your mission to include both human health and the environment, I would argue that almost by definition, there's going to be some change to the products you store, because the products that need storing are going to have to be things that are compatible with functioning natural systems, that circular economy I talked about, and with a stable climate. This slide gives you some idea, and I know this is a little presumptuous because this is your business, not mine, but as I was thinking about these are some of the things I can imagine Vopak storing in the future, and I think the good news is that you already store many of these things, and even the ones you don't store are really not all that different from the ones you do today. So, to summarize, at the most macro level, I think the energy system in 50 years will have at least these 4 features. I think it's going to have to contribute to a more circular economy. It's obviously going to have to meet consumer expectations, which are increasingly toward clean. It's always been about affordable and reliable, but I think clean is going to become, and clean I mean low carbon as well, is going to be a must. Therefore, it's going to be carbon neutral, and it's going to be much more electrified. Not totally, but more electrified than it is today. And I think over time, at least I hope this is what happens, I can see this beginning to happen, that we start to treat carbon dioxide not just as a waste product, and not just as a liability, but as an economic resource, something that actually could have value if you capture it and put it to productive use. I think that electricity and hydrogen are going to become two of humanity's main energy carriers. You may have noticed that they both cropped up regularly throughout in the three energy sectors. And I think it's for two main reasons. One, you can make one with the other, right? You can use hydrogen to make electricity, and you can use electricity to make hydrogen, so they're fungible in that way, they're interchangeable. And you can make both from a wide array of primary energy sources. Indeed, coming full circle, as the final step in that decarbonization evolution that I started with toward lower and lower carbon energy sources, it may be that we pivot away from hydrocarbons toward just hydrogen, at least for those things that don't lend themselves to electricity. So just a couple of final thoughts. You know, the energy picture that I have painted for you this afternoon assumes that globalization goes on pretty much as it has been. But I think it's worth at least entertaining the idea that another future is possible, and that's one of de-globalization, driven by nationalism and populism and trade barriers and possibly consumer preferences for local and regional production that place less of an emphasis on global trade, maybe even climate constraints. And in fact, just as a side note, I'm actually participating right now as part of an advisory group with The Ohio State University with a team of researchers looking at this exact question of what are the implications of a deglobalizing economy. And I'm not suggesting that's necessarily going to happen, but it maybe is worth, and maybe you're already doing this, it's maybe worth entertaining what would be the implications of that for Vopak's core business. Well, in any case, I hope this was a lot to take in after lunch. You guys are like, whoa, I thought this was going to be fun. I hope I have sparked your imagination about what the energy system might look like 50 years from now. You know, your company has this incredible long history of, again, anticipating where the world's going, and to use a Minnesota-ism for anyone who plays hockey, skating to where the puck is going to be. I would love to think that I'll be alive in 50 years, but that would make me 105. And while I'm an optimist, I also know that I love food and drink, so I'm not necessarily counting on 105, but I'd love to know how things turn out. But given your track record as a company, I have every confidence that you will be around, not just in 50 years, but in another 400. So, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Rolf.
Do you want me to stay for questions, or we're moving on?
Yes, no,
yeah?
Please, that's the next thing. Yes,
all right.
Anybody have any questions? Yes.
A very nice presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
It makes a lot of sense, the electric vehicles, especially in all the areas where renewables energies are being developed. But it was very interesting for me hearing about China, because China produces 72% of their energy today by coal, and it's expected by 2040 is still producing almost 50% of the energy by coal. So it doesn't add up very well using electric vehicles producing energy by coal.
It's a great point, and it's a question we actually get a lot. In other words, if you're switching to an electric vehicle and not using gasoline, but you're simply plugging into an electric grid where the electricity is made with coal, aren't you just moving the pollution from one source to another? Yeah?
Exactly, that's my point.
That's the question. So I can't speak to China. I mean, I do know you're right. I know that China is in so many ways a paradox because they are simultaneously, they are building more renewable energy than anybody else, and they're building coal plants. I do think that, I haven't looked at their latest 5-year plan, so your statistics may be right on, but I know that they have taken great measures to, mainly driven not by climate, but by air pollution concerns, and a worry that their air quality is going to become and is already becoming a drag on their potential for economic growth and prosperity. So I think that's why they're pushing so hard on electric vehicles. I will just say that in our part of the country, which is at the northern tier of the country, the whole sort of mid-continent portion of the US, our analysis suggests that actually even if you're just, for the average grid mix, the average mix of resources that are producing electricity where we are, it actually still is a pretty substantial climate benefit to switch to an electric vehicle. I would want to run the numbers in China to know whether or not, if it were 50% coal, would that still be a climate benefit? My guess is that it would be. But to me, the bet on electric vehicles is, even if it's not a lot cleaner today or better from a climate standpoint, you're sort of betting on the trajectory that I just got done talking about, that electricity production is going to get progressively less and less carbon intensive over time, and that therefore your vehicle would get cleaner and more climate friendly over time. But it's a very reasonable question. Yeah.
Other questions?
Wow, that light is bright. I've stunned you into silence. Yeah, please.
Hi, this is Rolf. On electrical vehicles, how do you look at the disposal of all these batteries once the lifetime of it is completed?
Another fantastic question. So if we're going to have a circular economy, what about all these doggone batteries? So I would say a couple of things. One is that I think the first, that reduce, reuse, recycle wheel, well, in the reuse portion, one thing that electric utilities are already doing is working with the OEMs, the automakers, to test, and this is already happening, test the use of taking those car batteries, which when they're no longer useful in an automobile, they actually typically have an enormous amount, sometimes 80% of their life is left, and they are using them as an electric grid resource. In other words, batteries installed on the electric grid to help buffer times when the wind is not blowing or the sun is not shining. So that's one reuse opportunity that it's currently being explored. But the question of end of life, what happens to those batteries? I'd be lying if I said I knew precisely what is being worked out, but I do know that conversation is already taking place, which is half the battle, right? Half the battle, this whole circular economy idea, it's not that we couldn't do it or we don't know how to do it. It's just that it's a different design assignment than the one we have. If you're an engineer and that's the challenge you're given, figure out how this product, whatever it is, whether it's a battery or something else, design that for me in a way that it has value to me at the end of its useful life. Go. So I think it's doable. I don't think we yet have all the systems in place to do it. I think it's going to be driven, though, not just by environmental concerns, but by economics. So one of the threats that China has been making in these trade wars that we're having is that they will control access to rare earth elements, which are essential. And so I think that not for batteries in particular, I think there's going to be an economic imperative to reclaim those batteries and to make sure that we're harvesting out of them as much as we can to reuse. But it's a really important question. I don't think we have it totally worked out.
Thank you so much, Rolf.
Yeah.
A hand of applause.
All right. Where's my Oscar? That's what I want to know. Where's my Oscar?
Oh, yeah, baby.
Sing, where's my Oscar?
Like a fool, I went and stayed too long.
I couldn't possibly take it away from you. You guys earned it.